All right, well, welcome to the final week, week 6. It's gone by quick and we've covered a lot of ground. So, like previous weeks, there are 3 chapters of content for you this week. Covers a lot from the period of Western expansion, which this painting is also often used as an expression of what we call manifest destiny, this notion that the United States was destined to move from east coast to west and, as you can see, drive everybody else off the land. So what's coming is technology and whiteness and American values. What's being lost is wildlife, nature, natives, etc. So Manifest Destiny has a direct impact on expansion because, as you can see, at the beginning of the 1840s, this is the western frontier. By 1850, the United States stretches all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This territory up here, circa 1840, was disputed between the United States and Great Britain, but a lot of Americans had settled, especially in Oregon, and then had started moving into the Puget Sound, up and down the Willamette Valley there in Oregon. So lots of Americans there, not as many British. So eventually we fixed the border there with Canada. And then what's key here is going to be Texas independence, leading to the Mexican War, and then the Mexican Cession, which is all this land that is basically taken from Mexico as a result of war that the United States started against Mexico. Started on purpose to gain this land, quite frankly. That the whole intention of fighting this war was to first gain Texas and then add California. The reason this is really key is because the question of slavery is going to be centered to all the discussion of how we turn these new territories into states. So it all begins with the Texas Revolution in 1835. A lot of Americans had moved into Texas. They had brought their slaves. They were growing cotton. Mexico tells them stop having slaves because they had banned slavery. The Americans now far outnumber any Mexican settlers in Texas. And so the war begins, and you've all heard of the Battle of the Alamo, and it lasts for a few months with the Texans, the Americans, defeating an army of Mexicans and declaring themselves the Texas Republic. Okay, and while all that's going on, so now Texas is an independent nation over here. A lot of people in the United States say, hey, let's annex Texas, but that would be seen as being good for the slave states, not so good for the northern states. So there's a lot of contention over Texas. James K. Polk runs for president in 1844, gets elected basically saying, I will get us Texas, and he's all but saying, I'll make sure we go to war with Mexico so we can get everything to California. And as you can see, he wins a fairly significant electoral college victory in 1844, becomes president, and gets his war. And so the war against Mexico lasts for a couple years. It's launched, you can read in the book about how it's launched in this area that was sort of disputed, which allowed Polk to have a reason to go to war because he could say that Mexican soldiers had invaded America and attacked Americans in America, or Texas, but the annexation was already on by then. And same thing, the Mexicans could say the same thing. Anyways, it was a pretty decisive victory, which led to all the land that was turned over following the war. And it also was very much a warm-up act for a lot of the officers who would lead on both sides during the Civil War. Both Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant fought in Mexico, as did Stonewall Jackson and Beauregard, and all the big names from the Civil War were part of that the fighting during the Mexican War, which occurred just about 15 years earlier. Okay, as part of this also, your book goes into westward expansion. The population is just growing incredibly. I won't go over it here, but your book talks about influx of especially Irish and Germans, lots of immigrants, and the effects this has on American politics. So a lot of this population growth is people coming from outside the country now, but it's also high birth rates because the economy is fairly strong. As part of this settlement, people are coming to California all of a sudden. I mean, literally within a year and a half of the United States claiming California at the end of the Mexican War, gold is discovered in large quantities up and down the Sierra Nevada around Sacramento. And this draws people to California in droves. And the book talks about how quickly San Francisco goes from, a village to a bustling city, the major port on the West Coast. Part of this is systematic destruction of Native Americans in California, of which there were many, many different tribal groups and identities and languages and life ways. I mean, the people of the mountain lived very differently than the people of the valleys, and different than the people of the coast. So there's a systematic attempt to actually eliminate Native Americans as a race in California, sponsored by the government, both the state government of California and then subsidized by the federal government. And here's a representation of population decline among Native Americans. Here's where the 10 years between the start and middle of the gold rush here, and you can see the significant drop. The victorious general of the war, Zachary Taylor, will use his fame as a general winning in Mexico to become president in the election of 1848. He will become the second president to die in office, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, will serve out the rest of his term. He died in 1850, while the great debate was going on over the Compromise of 1850. So you can read about this. I won't go into too much detail, but basically this was a deal to compromise work out in the Congress to bring Texas in as a state, California as a state, maintain the balance between free states and slave states in the Senate, but also work out some other issues like the slave trade, not slavery, but the slave trade in Washington, D.C., a new Fugitive Slave Act, which was very strong and allowed Southerners to basically chase down slaves and or free blacks they wanted to make slaves in the North, which Northerners hated. And it also allowed for this new idea of popular sovereignty in the territories here, specifically Utah and New Mexico, where popular sovereignty meaning that the people themselves will choose whether or not a state that's organized should be a slave state or a free state. The problem with the Compromise of 1850 is both sides felt that they got screwed. Neither side was happy with it. Compromises, yes, are supposed to make both sides uncomfortable, but in this, both sides really hated the results of this. And it just leads to tension. I mean, the divide now going into the decade of the 1850s is just, and read about this in chapter 15, it's just event after event after event that just, creates this sectional divide. A big one is going to be the organization of this part of the country west of the Mississippi into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. By terms of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, these two territories will also use popular sovereignty in order to determine status. And what happens is Kansas now has enough people to become a state, so they're ready to write a constitution and become a state. And to pick the people to write the Constitution, there's a popular vote where the men can go vote and choose their delegates to the convention that's going to write the state constitution. So, of course, pro-slavery proponents are going to vote for pro-slavery delegates and vice versa. And what you have happening then is a whole bunch of pro-slavery people who don't live in Kansas coming from Missouri and Arkansas and other places to pour into Kansas to vote in the election. And then we see the same thing happening with groups of or anti-slavery voters coming in from other states to vote in Kansas, even though they don't live there. And Kansas soon becomes what we call Bleeding Kansas. It's a warm-up act for the Civil War. People are now actually fighting, dying, killing each other over the issue of slavery in Kansas. In this mess comes a new party system, the demise of the Whigs. The Whigs just couldn't really maintain their coalition. The issue of slavery was just trashing it. And meanwhile, the Democrats had become the party of slavery. So their coalition was all about slavery. Although what's happening in the Democratic Party is you're getting a split north and south. So northern Democrats and southern Democrats. That's going to have a huge impact on events leading to the Civil War. So here's who's coming into the Republican Party. These new free soilers like Abraham Lincoln said that they weren't out to abolish slavery where it exists, but they want to prevent it from pushing into any of those new territories. Conscious Whigs, these were Whigs who were anti-slavery and felt their party wasn't doing enough to fight slavery. And then these Northern Democrats moving into the Republican Party. And the most famous Republican ever is Abraham Lincoln, obviously. He's the first president. He'll be elected in 1860. In this contested fight. And right on the eve of that election, this is John Brown, and he leads a raid on Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. In some sense, that's sort of the first fighting of the Civil War, even though it's not seen that way. Southerners are appalled at John Brown is treated like a saint in the North. He's treated as a martyr, like he'd gone down there and sacrificed his own life because he got caught, obviously. It was a failed, very, very poorly executed and big failure. But he showed that there were basically Northern terrorists willing to go into the South and start a race war over slavery. And that's what John Brown was. Then he was executed, and in the North he was treated like a martyr. And then here's the election of 1860, which because it was so split, I mean, you actually have two Democratic candidates, Douglas from the North, Breckinridge from the South. Abraham Lincoln able to get enough states for a fairly significant electoral college victory. That victory prompts immediately South Carolina to secede from the Union, and that's 1860, December of 1860. The states of the South start to secede. The first states to secede, and you can see, South Carolina was pretty much everyone's for secession, but most of the states of the South, they have significant areas where secession wasn't favored. And as you read about Southern society in the last week, you get this. You realize there were a lot of people who didn't have slaves, didn't rely on slavery, and had really no reason to want to go to war. So what happens is the first states secede, and then the fighting begins in April of 1830, and then these other states secede. And that's the Confederate States of America, and that's the beginning of the Civil War. Chapter 16 is all about the Civil War. There's lots of detail in there, lots of talk about the different battles and changes that go on, and it was a very significant war by far. More people died in that war alone than Americans died in every other war we've ever fought in our lives. So it was significant event, and at the very end in 1865, of course, Lincoln, the president, is assassinated, our first president to be assassinated. And then note that chapter 17 is not assigned. It's about Reconstruction. It occurs after 1865. 1865 is the stopping point for this course. We end with the end of the Civil War and the Lincoln assassination. But feel free to read chapter 17 because Reconstruction is an era that's often left out, and it's actually very significant. All right, I hope you enjoy this week's reading.